Lyon, France, March 17, 1942, 15:20 hours. Virginia Hall sat in the corner booth of Café du Soleil on Rue de la République, left leg extended straight under the table. The wooden prosthetic didn't bend at the knee. It never had. She'd nicknamed it Cuthbert after the hunting accident in Turkey 9 years earlier, a shotgun misfire that cost her everything below the left knee, and, she'd thought at the time, her future. The U.S. State Department had rejected her application in 1933. Foreign service officers couldn't have disabilities. She'd learned French, Italian, and German anyway, studied at schools across Europe anyway, and when the war came in 1939, she'd offered herself to the only intelligence service that would take a one-legged woman, the British Special Operations Executive. She was 36 years old. She'd been operating in Vichy, France for 9 months under the code name Marie Monin. The Germans who controlled the northern zone and influenced the collaborationist Vichy government in the south had walked past her in cafes, on trains, in government offices. They saw a slight American woman with auburn hair and a noticeable limp. Harmless, possibly deserving of sympathy. They didn't see the radio operator who coordinated supply drops for 6 resistance networks across the Lyon region. They didn't see the organizer who maintained safe houses from Vichy to Paris. They didn't see the intelligence officer who'd sent 47 reports to London in the past 6 months, detailing German troop movements, factory production, and collaborator identities. The wooden leg was her greatest asset. No one suspected a cripple of running the most productive SOE network in central France. But now she had a problem that required movement, coordination, and risk on a scale she hadn't yet attempted. 3 Allied airmen sat in Fresnes prison, 12 kilometers south of Paris, shot down over occupied France 6 days earlier during a bombing raid on the Renault factory at Bouillon-Billancourt, captured by Wehrmacht units before resistance forces could reach them, transferred to Fresnes on March 14th, scheduled for interrogation by the Gestapo, then transferred to POW camps in Germany, or worse, if the Gestapo suspected they'd made contact with French civilians before capture. The message from her contact in Paris arrived via courier at 0830 hours that morning. 3 Americans, holding cell Block D, guards on 8-hour rotation, transfer order expected within 72 hours. If they removed to Germany, they'd disappear into the Stalag system. If they talked during interrogation, and everyone talked eventually, they might compromise the resistance contacts who'd tried to help them. And if the Gestapo connected them to the escape networks SOE was running through France, Hall's entire operation could collapse. She had to get them out before the transfer. The problem was that organizing a prison break from Fresnes, a fortress-style prison inside the occupied zone, would require bribing guards, forging paperwork, coordinating resistance fighters in Paris she'd never met face-to-face, and doing it all within 72 hours while maintaining her cover as a disabled American journalist living in unoccupied Vichy, France. And she'd have to do it without leaving Lyon, because traveling to Paris would require passing through the demarcation line between Vichy and occupied France, presenting papers at German checkpoints, and risking exposure of the wooden leg that was distinctive enough to remember. At 15:47 hours, a man in a gray worker's jacket entered the café. Jean Rousseau, resistance organizer from the Liberté Network, communist, former railway worker, 43 years old, wanted by Vichy police for sabotage. He sat across from her without ordering. "The Americans," Hall said in French, voice low enough to disappear under the café noise. "Friends, you have contacts inside?" Rousseau's face didn't change. "One guard, second shift. He lost a son at Dunkirk. The Germans left the boy to die on the beach. Can he be bought? To enough money, he'll forget to lock a door." "How much?" 50,000 francs. Hall calculated. 50,000 francs was half her operational budget for the month. London wouldn't authorize that kind of expenditure for 3 airmen with weeks of approval process. She'd have to use her discretionary funds and explain it later. "Done," she said. "But we need papers, transfer orders, official stamps. Paulette can manage that. She works in the records office at the Préfecture de Police, but she'll need 48 hours. We have 72 before the Germans move them, if the transfer doesn't come earlier." Hall nodded. The timeline was impossible to guarantee. German efficiency was unpredictable, sometimes sloppy, sometimes ruthlessly fast. But if she waited for certainty, the airman would be gone. "Set it up," she said. "Guard gets the money when the doors are open, not before. Paulette gets half now, half on delivery of the papers. Extraction team needs to be in position 24 hours before execution." Rousset spewed. "The guard wants assurance. If this fails, the Gestapo will torture him before they shoot him." "Tell him if this fails, the Gestapo will be torturing all of us," Hall said, "including the American woman with one leg who's paying him enough money to disappear to Spain if he's smart." Rousset almost smiled. Then he was gone. Hall sat in the cafe for another 20 minutes, watching the street. The wooden leg ached where the leather straps cut into her thigh. It always ached by mid-afternoon. The prosthetic weighed 8 pounds and distributed the weight poorly. She'd developed calluses on her stump and a permanent limp she couldn't hide even when she tried. That limp had gotten her through a dozen checkpoints. German soldiers saw the awkward gait and waved her through without searching her handbag, which often contained coded messages, silk maps, and contact lists that would have earned her a bullet in the back of the head. But the limp also meant she couldn't run, couldn't climb quickly, couldn't fight if cornered. If the prison break went wrong and she had to flee, Cuthbert would get her killed. She left the cafe at 16:15 hours and walked 3 blocks to her apartment on Rue Garibaldi. Second floor, 2 rooms. A radio hidden in the fireplace behind a false brick panel. A Colt .32 automatic pistol under the mattress. A cyanide pill in a lipstick tube in her purse in case the Gestapo ever came through the door. At 19:30 hours, she transmitted her daily report to London using the SOE-issued radio. 15 minutes maximum transmission time to avoid German directing finding units. She encoded the message using her one-time pad cipher, tapped it out in Morse at 22 words per minute, and shut down at 19:44 hours. She didn't mention the prison break. London would have forbidden it. For the next 48 hours, Hall waited. Rousset sent confirmation via courier on March 19, papers completed, guard agreed, extraction team in position. The break was scheduled for March 21 at 0230 hours, during the shift change, when security was loosest. Hall couldn't be there. She couldn't travel to Paris without risking exposure. She had to trust people she'd never met to execute an operation that could destroy everything she'd built. The wooden leg kept her safe in Lyon, but it trapped her there. At 0600 hours on March 22, the courier arrived with a 4-word message written on cigarette paper. 3 packages delivered safely. The Allied airmen were out, hidden in a safe house in the 13th arrondissement. Within a week, they'd be moved down the escape line through Vichy, France, over the Pyrenees into Spain, and eventually back to England. The first prison break was complete. Hall burned the message and flushed the ashes. Then she sat at her table and allowed herself 30 seconds of satisfaction before considering the implications. The Gestapo would investigate. They'll question the guards, review the paperwork, search for whoever had organized this. The forged transfer orders were good, but not perfect. Someone would notice inconsistencies. And when they did, they'd start looking for the organizer. They'd be looking for a resistance fighter, a communist saboteur, a French patriot. They wouldn't be looking for a crippled American woman who wrote newspaper articles about life in Vichy, France, and needed a cane to walk 3 blocks. That was her advantage for now. But she'd just proven something. Prison breaks were possible. Airmen and agents could be recovered. The Gestapo wasn't infallible. And within 3 months, she'd have to prove it again. June 12, 1942, 13:40 hours. Montluc Prison, Lyon. The second prison break came 3 months later, and this time Hall couldn't delegate the planning to contacts in Paris. This time, the prisoners were in her own city, and one of them was her radio operator. Gilbert Turk, age 29, French national, SOE-trained wireless operator, inserted into Lyon in April to help manage the increased radio traffic from Hall's expanding networks. Arrested June 8 during a Gestapo sweep of the Croix-Rousse district after a collaborator identified a safe house. Held in Montluc prison, a 19th-century fortress on the eastern edge of Lyon, built to hold 600 prisoners, but now crammed with over 1,200 resistance fighters, political prisoners, and black market operators. Turk knew every contact in Hall's network. He knew the safe house locations. He knew the radio frequencies, the cipher keys, the supply drop coordinates. Under Gestapo interrogation, and the Gestapo had refined interrogation into a science of systematic pain, he'd eventually break. Everyone did. Hall gave him 72 hours before he started talking, maybe 96 if he was exceptionally tough. He'd been inside for 89 hours. The problem was that Montluc wasn't friend. No sympathetic guards, no administrative offices where forged paperwork could create confusion. Montluc was run by Vichy French police who cooperated enthusiastically with German intelligence, and the Gestapo maintained an office inside the prison, specifically for interrogations. But prisoners had to be transported from Montluc to Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Berthelot for extended interrogation sessions, from Montluc to the train station for deportation to Germany, and during transport, they were vulnerable. Hall sat in the back room of a bookstore on Rue de la Charité, wooden legs stretched out to ease the pressure on her stump, and studied a hand-drawn map of the route between Montluc prison and Gestapo headquarters. 2 kilometers, 14 turns, 3 bridges across the Rhône. The transport used the same route every time. German efficiency preferred predictability over security. Across from her sat 3 men. Edmond Lebras, 34, former French Army sergeant with the 14th Infantry Division, captured at Sedan in 1940, escaped from German POW camp in 1941, now running ambush operations for the Combat Resistance Network. Raoul Pellissier, 27, communist organizer, expert in explosives, wanted for the bombing of a collaborationist newspaper office. And François Garel, 41, former Lyon police officer who deserted when the Vichy government ordered him to arrest Jews, still had his uniform and identification. The convoy leaves Montluc at 0000 hours. 1 truck, 4 guards, 2 in front, 2 in back with the prisoners. They take Rue Jean Hachette to Avenue Berthelot. Vide varies, but they slow to 15 kilometers per hour for the turn onto Rue Paul Bert because the intersection is tight. How many prisoners in the truck? Lebras asked. Between 4 and 8, depending on the day. Turk will be among them. I have confirmation from a kitchen worker who saw the transport schedule. Guards armed? MAS-36 rifles, sidearms. The driver carries an MP-40 submachine gun. 4 guards, potentially 8 prisoners, moving vehicle. Lebras shook his head. Even at slow speed, we'd need to stop the truck, neutralize the guards, identify Turk among the prisoners, extract him, and disappear before reinforcements arrive. 2 minutes maximum, probably 90 seconds. 60 seconds, Hall said. Gestapo headquarters is 400 meters from that intersection. They'll hear gunfire. Then we can't use guns. Pellissier leaned forward. I can disable the truck. Small explosive charge in the road, triggered remotely, blows the front tire and axle. Truck stops, but the explosion will draw attention just like gunfire. Not if it looks like an accident, Garel said. Construction zones all over Lyon, damaged roads. A truck hitting a pothole and breaking an axle wouldn't be suspicious for the first 30 seconds. Hall nodded. 30 seconds to stop, 60 seconds to extract, 30 seconds to clear the area before the guards understand what happened. How do we neutralize 4 armed guards in 60 seconds without killing them? Lebras asked. Dead guards mean German reprisals. They'll shoot 50 hostages. Hall said we don't neutralize all 4.
Francois, you'll be in your old police uniform at the intersection, directing traffic around the construction zone. When the truck stops, you approach as if you're helping. You get the driver's attention, keep him focused on you. Edmond and Raoul come from behind. Grab Turk specifically, I'll give you his description, and pull him into the construction site. There's a sewer entrance 20 meters south. You disappear underground before the guards realize they've lost a prisoner. And if the guards in the back see us taking him, they're watching 8 prisoners in a dark truck. They won't notice one missing for 10, maybe 15 seconds. By then, you're gone. Pelissier studied the map. The sewer system connects to the Rhône. Exits under the Pont de la Guillotière, 200 meters west. I'll have a boat waiting. A boat, Raoul repeated, in daylight, on the Rhône, with German patrols on both banks. A fishing boat, Hall said. 2 men fishing, nothing suspicious. Turk stays underwater, breathing through a reed until you're past the patrol points. 1 kilometer downstream, you beach on the western bank. There's a safe house on Rue Molière. The 3 men were silent for a moment. This is insane, Garel finally said. It's also the only option, Hall replied. Turk knows everything. If he talks, 40 people die. This network collapses. The Germans win. When? Lebrun asked. Tomorrow, June 13th. The convoy leaves at 0000 hours. You have 18 hours to prepare.
June 13th, 1942. 0847 hours. Hall stood 400 meters from the intersection of Rue Jean Hachette and Rue Paul Bert, leaning against a pharmacy wall. Wooden leg angled to support her weight. She wore a brown dress, a wide-brimmed hat, and carried a shopping bag with 2 baguettes visible at the top. A woman buying bread, nothing more. She couldn't be closer. If the operation failed and the Gestapo arrested the team, she couldn't be anywhere near the scene. But she needed to see it happen, needed to know if Turk got out. At 0853 hours, Garel appeared at the intersection in his police uniform, set up a wooden barricade, and began directing the sparse morning traffic around an area of torn-up cobblestones. The construction zone was real. Pelissier had dug it himself at 0200 hours and left debris scattered convincingly. At 0858 hours, the prison transport truck turned onto Rue Jean Hachette. A Citroën Type 23 cargo truck, gray paint, covered bed, moving at approximately 25 kilometers per hour. At 0859 hours, the truck slowed for the turn onto Rue Paul Bert. Pelissier, hidden in a doorway 30 meters away, triggered the charge. The explosion was small, a muffled crack like a truck backfiring. The right front tire disintegrated. The axle snapped. The truck lurched right, scraped against the curb, and stopped directly in the construction zone. Garel was moving before the truck fully stopped, approaching the driver's window, waving his arms, shouting about the damaged road and negligent public works department. The driver rolled down his window, focused on Garel. The 2 guards in the back of the truck shouted at the driver, asking what happened. Lebrun and Pelissier came from behind the barricade, fast but not running, wearing workers' coveralls. They stepped into the back of the truck through the canvas opening, as if checking on the prisoners after the accident. Hall counted seconds. 5, 10, 15. Lebrun emerged from the truck, supporting a thin man in prison gray who appeared dazed. Turk. They walked him toward the construction debris behind a pile of cobblestones. 30 seconds. The guard saw Pelissier walking away and shouted. Pelissier kept walking. The guard raised his rifle. Garel stepped between them, still playing his role, telling the guard to calm down. The worker was just trying to help. Nobody was hurt. 40 seconds. The guard pushed past Garel and ran toward the sewer entrance. Pelissier was gone. 50 seconds. The guard stared into the sewer opening, then turned and ran back to the truck, shouting for the driver. Hall turned and walked in the opposite direction, slow and limping, just another disabled woman heading to market, invisible in the morning crowd.
At 11:30 a.m., a courier brought confirmation. Turk extracted successfully, moved to the safe house on Rue Molière. Minimal injuries from interrogation, radio intact, ready to resume operations within 48 hours. But at 1400 hours, a second message arrived. Gestapo raids on 3 safe houses across Lyon, 8 arrests, German forces searching the Croix-Rousse district door to door. The prison break had succeeded, but the Gestapo was responding with a level of aggression Hall hadn't seen before. Someone in the German intelligence apparatus had noticed the pattern. 2 successful prisoner extractions in 3 months, American and British airmen and agents disappearing from supposedly secure facilities, resistance networks operating with unusual coordination and funding. Someone was asking questions, and Hall's wooden leg, the disability that made her invisible, wouldn't protect her if they started looking at every foreigner in Lyon, disabled or not.
September 24, 1942. 0615 hours. Lyon. The third prison break was different because this time Virginia Hall had to walk into the prison herself. The prisoner was Dr. Jean Rousseau, the same resistance organizer who'd helped her arrange the Fraise operation 6 months earlier. Arrested September 19 during a Gestapo raid on a printing facility in the Guillotière district, where his network had been producing forged ration cards. Held in Montluc prison. Scheduled for transfer to Gestapo headquarters at 1400 hours on September 24. Rousseau knew Hall's real identity, knew she was American, SOE, operating undercover as a journalist, knew her address on Rue Garibaldi, knew the locations of 7 safe houses, the identities of 12 key contacts, and the radio frequencies she used to communicate with London. The Gestapo had been interrogating him for 5 days. Hall had to assume he'd already broken. She'd evacuated 2 safe houses and moved her radio, but she couldn't evacuate herself. Leaving Lyon would mean abandoning the networks she'd spent 15 months building, and she couldn't let Rousseau be transferred to Avenue Berthelot, where the Gestapo's more experienced interrogators would extract every remaining detail. The problem was that Montluc had tightened security after the June extraction. No more predictable transport schedules. Guards rotated randomly. Prisoner movements happened with minimal advance notice. The Vichy police who ran the prison had been reprimanded by their German overseers, and reprimanded men were careful men. But there was one vulnerability. Montluc still allowed approved visitors, family members, lawyers, clergy. Visits happened in a ground-floor room under guard supervision, 15 minutes maximum, no physical contact permitted. And visitors didn't get searched as thoroughly as prisoners. Hall's contact inside the prison administrative office, a filing clerk named Marguerite who'd lost her husband to a German firing squad, had managed to add a name to the approved visitor list for Jean Rousseau, Marie Leblanc, representing the Lyon Legal Aid Society, authorized to discuss prisoner rights under Vichy law. Marie Leblanc didn't exist, but the paperwork was perfect and the visit was approved for 1100 hours on September 24. 3 hours before Rousseau's scheduled transfer. Hall had 3 hours to get into Montluc, pass Rousseau the tools he'd need to escape during the transfer, and get out without the guards realizing that the limping American woman with the legal documents was the same SOE agent the Gestapo had started calling the organizer in their internal communications. The wooden leg was her cover. It was also her death sentence if anything went wrong, because she couldn't run. September 24, 1942, 10:47 hours. Hall arrived at Montluc prison carrying a leather briefcase containing legal documents, a notebook, 2 pencils, and a rosary. She wore a dark blue suit, low heels to minimize the limp, wire-rimmed glasses she didn't need, and a silver crucifix on a chain. Her hair was pinned back severely. She looked like exactly what the papers said she was, a legal aid representative visiting a prisoner to discuss due process rights. The guard at the entrance was Vichy French police, not German. Approximately 40 years old, mustache, bored expression.
He examined her papers for 30 seconds, looked at her face, looked back at the papers. Purpose of visit? Legal consultation. Prisoner Rousseau, Jean. Scheduled for 1100 hours. Her French was flawless, with a neutral accent of educated Paris, nothing that suggested American origin. Briefcase. She opened it. The guard glanced at the documents, saw the rosary, nodded. He didn't search thoroughly, didn't check the false bottom where Hall had hidden the small hacksaw blade, a vial of sedative powder, and 500 francs in small bills. Second floor, visitor room C. 15 minutes. Guard will be present. Hall nodded and walked toward the stairs. The wooden leg echoed against the stone floor. She climbed the stairs slowly, awkwardly, using the handrail. 2 guards on the landing watched her struggle. One of them looked away, uncomfortable. The other watched with vague pity. Neither of them saw a threat. Visitor room C was a gray rectangle, 3 meters by 4 meters, 1 barred window, 1 table, 2 chairs, 1 guard standing by the door. The guard was younger, maybe 25, French police uniform, MAS-36 rifle slung over his shoulder. Hall sat in the chair facing the door, arranged her briefcase on the table, and waited. At 11:03 hours, they brought in Rousseau. He looked worse than she had expected. Face bruised, left eye swollen shut, right hand bandaged. He walked with a limp that mirrored hers. They'd done something to his legs. The guards had beaten him, and the Gestapo had refined the process.
But his good eye focused on her immediately, and she saw recognition, then confusion, then understanding. He knew who she was. He knew what she was risking by being here. He sat across from her. Monsieur Rousseau, Hall said in a formal tone, speaking for the guard's benefit. I'm Marie Leblanc, Lyon Legal Aid Society. I'm here to discuss your rights under the current detention laws. Rousseau nodded slowly. Hall opened her notebook, began writing, then slid the notebook across the table so Rousseau could see. The guard was 3 meters away, couldn't see the words. She'd written, "Transfer today, 1400. Tools in briefcase. Guard change, 1330. Wait for my signal." Rousseau's good eye moved across the words. He nodded again, as if agreeing with a legal point. Hall pulled the notebook back, wrote another line, slid it across. "Can you walk?" Rousseau spoke for the first time, voice rough. "The charges are political. I've committed no crime under French law." "French law currently defers to Vichy authority," Hall replied, keeping her tone neutral. Under the table, out of the guard's line of sight, she opened the false bottom of her briefcase. Rousseau continued speaking about his case, providing cover noise, while Hall extracted the hacksaw blade, wrapped in cloth to prevent noise. She palmed it, held it low, extended her hand across the table as if offering the sympathetic gesture. The guard at the door shifted his weight. Hall froze. The guard was watching her hand, watching the exchange. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then the guard said, "No physical contact with prisoners." Hall withdrew her hand, the blade still concealed in her palm. "My apologies, I forget myself." The guard settled back against the doorframe. Hall's heart rate was 140 beats per minute, but her face showed nothing. She placed her hand on her lap, under the table, still holding the blade. She needed a new approach. She shifted in her chair, intentionally awkward, and winced. "Forgive me, Monsieur Rousseau. I have difficulty sitting for extended periods and old injury." Rousseau understood immediately. "You should stand if you need to." Hall stood, leaning heavily on the table as if the wooden leg required support. She moved around the table, closer to Rousseau, still facing the guard, posture suggesting pain and difficulty rather than threat. The guard watched but didn't object. A disabled woman adjusting her position wasn't worth intervention. Hall stood next to Rousseau's chair, one hand on the table for balance. The other hand, the one holding the blade, dropped to her side, level with Rousseau's bandaged hand. "The Vichy courts may show leniency if you cooperate,"
she said, voice carrying to the guard. Rousseau moved his bandaged hand slightly, palm up. Hall dropped the blade. It landed in his palm. He closed his fingers and moved his hand to his lap in one smooth motion. The guards saw nothing. Hall returned to her chair, moving slowly, limping deliberately. She sat, reopened her notebook, continued writing meaningless legal notes. At 11:14 hours, the guard said, "Time." 11 minutes. Not the full 15, but enough. Hall gathered her papers. "Monsieur Rousseau, I'll file a petition with the Vichy legal office. I cannot promise success." Rousseau met her eye. "You've done more than I expected." The guard opened the door. Hall limped out, briefcase in hand, down the stairs, across the entrance hall, past the guard station. She was 5 meters from the exit when she heard shouting from the second floor. Male voices, running footsteps. The guard at the entrance door grabbed his rifle. Hall kept walking, slow and awkward, no change in pace. The guard looked at her, then toward the stairs where the commotion was growing louder.
"Wait," he said. Hall stopped, turned, face calm. "Is there a problem?" More shouting, a whistle, the sound of doors slamming. The guard at the entrance raised his rifle, not pointing it at Hall, but holding it ready. "Nobody leaves until An officer burst from the stairwell. "Lock down. Close the main entrance. Prisoner found with contraband." The entrance guard moved toward the door to seal it. Hall had perhaps 3 seconds before the prison locked down completely and everyone inside was searched, questioned, detained. She took 1 step toward the door, wooden leg loud against the stone, and her leg buckled. It wasn't intentional. The leather strap on the prosthetic had loosened during the climb upstairs, and the weight distribution shifted wrong. She fell hard, briefcase skidding across the floor, papers scattering. Both guards turned toward the sound. Hall gasped in genuine pain, clutching her left leg with a prosthetic attached. "Please, help!" The entrance guard hesitated, looking between the disabled woman on the floor and the officer still shouting about lockdown. The officer ran past Hall toward the entrance, barking orders. "Search all visitors from the past hour. Nobody leaves." The entrance guard moved to help Hall up. It was the mistake she needed. She gripped his arm, let him pull her to her feet, put weight on him as if unable to stand alone. "My leg, it's damaged. I need—" "You need to sit down," the guard said, trying to guide her toward a bench. "No, please, I need to get to a doctor. The attachment is broken. If I don't fix it, I can't walk." She was babbling now, voice rising toward panic, entirely believable because the pain was real and the fear was real. The officer noticed her for the first time, saw the wooden leg, the scattered papers, legal documents, prisoner rights forms, nothing incriminating. "Search her briefcase," he said. The entrance guard picked up the briefcase, opened it, found the notebook, pencils, rosary, checked the lining, found nothing. Hall had removed the false bottom panel in the visitor room, left it wedged under her chair where Rousseau could retrieve it later. The officer grabbed the notebook, flipped through pages of legal notes, all in perfect French, all completely legitimate. He looked at Hall again. She was leaning against the wall now, face pale, breathing hard, clutching the wooden leg. "Name? Marie LeBlanc, Lyon Legal Aid Society." Her voice shook, easy to fake when actual fear was flooding her system. "You met with Rousseau?" "Yes, 15 minutes. The guard was present the entire time." She gestured toward the younger guard now descending the stairs. The officer called to him. "Did this woman make physical contact with the prisoner?" The young guard shook his head. "No, sir, I prevented it. She tried to offer him her hand. I stopped her. She never touched him." Hall silently thanked the guard's vigilance. His testimony cleared her. The officer steadied her for 5 more seconds. A disabled woman, legal papers, a guard confirming no contact, nothing suspicious except timing. But timing alone wasn't proof. "Get out," he said, finally. "If we need you for questioning, we have your information." Hall gathered her papers with shaking hands. Some of the shaking was strategic, some wasn't, and limped toward the door. The wooden leg had never felt heavier. Every step echoed. Every step expected a shout from behind, an order to stop, a rifle bolt slamming home. She reached the exit, pushed through, descended the 5 steps to street level, one agonizing step at a time, turned left on Rue Jean Hachette, and walked 50 meters before allowing herself to breathe. September 24th, 1942, 1400 hours. Hall sat in a different cafe 4 blocks from Montluc, drinking coffee that had no actual coffee in it, wartime ersatz made from chicory and acorns, and waiting for confirmation. At 15:07 hours, the courier arrived.
a young woman, maybe 19, carrying a basket of vegetables. She sat at Hall's table without asking, set the basket down, spoke quietly while pretending to examine an apple. Rousseau didn't make it. Transfer happened early. He tried to use the blade during the vehicle stop, wounded one guard before they shot him, dead on the scene. Hall felt the words like a physical blow. Rousseau was 43 years old, former railway worker, communist organizer, father of 2. He'd helped her rescue 3 Allied airmen from friends. He'd risked everything. And now he was dead because she'd miscalculated the timing. The children? Hall asked. Safe. His network is moving them to the unoccupied zone tonight. Hall nodded, stood, left money on the table, and walked out. She'd succeeded in getting the tools to Rousseau. She'd escaped the prison when discovery should have meant arrest and execution. The wooden leg had saved her again. The disability was a kind of armor, making her invisible even when she was standing directly in front of German officers. But Rousseau was dead. 3 prison breaks, 2 complete successes, 1 failure, and the Gestapo was learning. At 1940 hours, Hall returned to her apartment on Rue Garibaldi and found a message slipped under her door, from Marguerite, the prison clerk who'd added Hall's false name to the visitor list. The message was 3 words: they suspect Americans. Hall burned it in the kitchen sink and watched the paper turn to ash. The net was tightening. The Gestapo was refining their search. They noticed the pattern: coordinated operations, professional planning, access to money and forged documents. They knew it wasn't just French resistance fighters acting independently. They knew someone was organizing this, someone with training and resources, someone foreign. The wooden leg had made her invisible for 18 months, but invisibility only worked as long as the Gestapo didn't know what they were looking for. And now they were starting to look for Americans.
November 3, 1942. 02:40 hours, Lyon. Virginia Hall woke to the sound of truck engines in the street below her apartment. German engines, Opel Blitz trucks, 3 of them, recognizable by the particular grinding sound of their transmission gears. She'd learned to identify vehicle types by sound during 18 months of operations. It was the difference between rolling over and going back to sleep versus grabbing the emergency bag and going out the window. She was out of bed in 4 seconds, wooden leg already strapped on, because she never slept without it anymore, not since the Gestapo had started raiding apartments at dawn. The emergency bag was under the bed, Colt 32 automatic, 5,000 francs, false identity papers, cyanide capsule, 1 change of clothes. She grabbed it and moved to the window. The trucks had stopped 3 buildings down. Wehrmacht soldiers were dismounting. No, not Wehrmacht. Gestapo. 15 men in long leather coats carrying MP-40 submachine guns, moving with the efficiency of a unit that had done this many times before. They entered the building at 34 Rue Garibaldi. Hall lived at 42 Rue Garibaldi. She had maybe 10 minutes before they worked their way up the street, maybe less if they were hitting multiple addresses simultaneously. She went through the apartment in 90 seconds, working from a mental checklist she'd rehearsed dozens of times. Radio components removed from the fireplace and scattered into 3 separate bags that would be carried out by different people. Code books burned in the sink, contact lists already memorized. She'd stopped writing them down in September. False identity papers for 3 separate personas hidden in different locations throughout the apartment, so whoever came after her would find one set and stop searching, missing the others. At 02:43 hours, she heard boots on the stairs. Not her building, the building next door, number 40. They were moving faster than she'd calculated. Hall grabbed the emergency bag, locked the apartment door behind her. Locked doors bought time, even if only a minute, and went down the back stairs to the courtyard exit. The wooden leg made noise on the stairs, no matter how carefully she moved. She compensated by moving during the moments when the Gestapo engines were loudest, masking the sound. The courtyard exit led to an alley running behind the Rue de la Pardue. Behind her, she heard wood splintering, shouting in German, "Raus, schnell!" They'd reached her building. Hall walked north on Rue de la Pardue, maintaining the slow, awkward pace her wooden leg required. Running would draw attention. A woman walking at 0:45 hours was unusual, but not criminal. Shift workers, medical emergencies, family crises. A woman running was suspicious.
She reached the safe house on Rue Molière at 03:11 hours, knocked 3 times, pause, twice more. No answer. She knocked again. The code was correct. Someone should be here. This safe house always maintained at least one person overnight for emergencies exactly like this. Still no answer. Hall felt cold understanding settle into her chest. The Gestapo hadn't just raided her apartment. They'd coordinated simultaneous raids across the network. They had a list. She moved to the secondary safe house on Rue de la Barre, arrived at 03:29 hours, found the door hanging open and Gestapo seals on the frame, raided within the past 24 hours. The third safe house on Rue Vendôme showed lights in the windows. Someone was awake or the Gestapo was inside waiting. Hall didn't approach. By 0400 hours, she'd exhausted her immediate options in Lyon. 7 safe houses compromised or unavailable. Her apartment raided, the radio network disrupted, and she was walking the streets before dawn with a wooden leg that made her identifiable to anyone looking for a limping woman. She needed to get out of Lyon, immediately. But first, she needed to understand what had happened. November 3, 1942, 01:20 hours. Virginia Hall met her courier contact, the 19-year-old woman who'd brought news about Rousseau in September, in the Parc de la Tête d'Or, on a bench near the lake where conversation could be masked by distance from other people. The girl's name was Suzanne. She arrived carrying the same vegetable basket, sat beside Hall, fed bread to the ducks, and spoke without looking at her. The Gestapo knows about the limping lady. Hall kept her face neutral. What does that mean? Wanted poster. Went up 2 days ago, November 1st. They're calling you the most dangerous Allied spy in France. The poster describes a woman, approximately 35 to 40 years old, limps on the left leg, speaks perfect French, possibly American or British, organizing resistance networks in the Lyon region. Reward of 50,000 Reichsmarks for information leading to capture. 50,000 Reichsmarks. Hall calculated quickly. That was roughly 2 years' salary for a French factory worker, life-changing money for anyone willing to betray her. How specific is the poster? Very. They don't have your name, but they have the limp, and they're connecting it to the prison breaks. Someone talked. Hall considered the timeline. Rousseau died September 24th, 6 weeks ago. The Gestapo would have interrogated everyone involved in his network after his death. Someone had broken. Someone had mentioned the American woman with the wooden leg who organized operations and paid in British pounds and French francs. How many arrests last night? 12 confirmed, maybe more. They hit addresses across Guilletière, Croix-Rousse, and your street. They're looking for you specifically. The radio operators? Turk got out. He was at a girlfriend's apartment, not on any of our lists, but Leclerc was arrested, and they seized one of the radios. One radio meant the Germans could potentially trace frequencies, identify patterns, decrypt old messages if they broke the codes. One radio was a disaster. Have you had contact with London? Suzanne shook her head. Turk is trying to establish communication, but he's operating from a backup location without the proper crystals. It could take days. Days Hall didn't have. I need to get to Spain, Hall said. The Pyrenees crossing? Suzanne's voice carried doubt. In November? The passes are already snow-covered, and you'd have to... She stopped, glanced at Hall's left leg. I'd have to walk 50 miles through mountain terrain on a wooden leg, Hall finished. I know. They say it's impossible even for healthy men. The altitude, the cold, the German and Spanish patrols. People die attempting it. People also die in Gestapo interrogation rooms, Hall said. I'll take the mountains. Suzanne was quiet for a moment. Then, there's a Basque guide named Lyon. He knows the passes. He's taken British airmen over, some of your people. He's expensive.
How expensive? 50,000 francs. Hall had 23,000 francs remaining from her operational budget. London would need to authorize an emergency transfer, but London didn't know her cover was blown because she couldn't reach London. Can you get a message to Turk? Tell him to transmit emergency extraction request to SOE. American operative Diane requests immediate withdrawal, crossing Pyrenees from Perpignan. Authorization for funds transfer to local contacts. Diane was Hall's SOE code name. Using it in an emergency transmission would signal London that the situation was critical. "I'll try," Suzanne said, "but transmission could take 48 hours, and the Germans will be listening." "Then Turk needs to make it fast and move immediately after. One burst transmission, then shut down and relocate." Suzanne nodded and stood, basket in hand. She walked away without looking back. Hall sat on the bench for another 10 minutes, watching the ducks, thinking through logistics. 50 miles over the Pyrenees, in November, with a wooden leg that already caused pain during normal walking and would be catastrophic on steep mountain terrain, in snow, at altitude, with German patrols on the French side and Spanish authorities on the other side who would arrest her and potentially hand her back to the Germans. The rational choice was to stay in Lyon, operate more carefully, rebuild the network from a more secure position. But rational choices assumed the Gestapo didn't already have her description, didn't already know about the wooden leg, weren't already offering enough money to make every collaborator in Lyon interested in finding her. She'd been invisible for 18 months. The wooden leg had been perfect cover. Who suspects a cripple? But now the Germans knew. The disability that had protected her was now a targeting marker. Every time she walked down the street, the distinctive limp identified her to anyone who'd seen the poster. The wooden leg had become a death sentence. November 6, 1942, 18:30 hours, Perpignan. Hall reached Perpignan 3 days later after a circuitous route through Vichy, France that required 4 separate train changes, 6 false identity checks, and 1 close call when a Vichy police officer at the Nîmes station stared at her limp for 10 seconds too long before waving her through. Perpignan was 30 kilometers from the Spanish border, nestled in the eastern Pyrenees foothills. The town was crowded with refugees, black market operators, smugglers, and Allied servicemen waiting for passage over the mountains. The Vichy authorities knew what was happening, but looked the other way for the right price. The Gestapo knew too, and they were watching. Hall checked into a small hotel on Rue de la Révolution, using the identity papers for Germaine Lecomte, a widow from Toulouse visiting family. The hotel owner looked at her wooden leg and asked no questions. Half the guests in Perpignan had something to hide. At 21:40 hours, there was a knock on her door. 3 rapid taps. Hall opened it with the Colt 32 in her hand, hidden behind the doorframe. The man in the hallway was short, maybe 160 centimeters, powerful built, weathered face, age indeterminate, could be 40, could be 60. He wore peasant clothing and carried a walking stick. "Suzanne sent me," he said, in French, heavily accented with Basque. "I'm Lyon." Hall let him in, locked the door. Lyon looked at her leg. "You're the American?" "Yes." "They say you want to cross the mountains?" "Yes." He shook his head. "Not with that leg. Impossible. The paths are steep, snow and ice. You'll fall, break your neck, or you'll slow us down and we'll all freeze. I don't take cripples over the mountains." Hall had expected this. She'd prepared the counter-argument during the 3-day journey to Perpignan. "I'm 36 years old. I've been walking on this leg for 9 years. I've walked through Lyon, through forests, upstairs, through mud. I'm slower than an able-bodied person, but I can walk for hours. I can manage pain, and I can pay you 75,000 francs instead of 50,000. Lyon's expression didn't change. "Where will you get 75,000 francs? "London authorized the transfer. The money is waiting with a contact in Perpignan. You get half now, half when we reach Spain." This was a lie. London hadn't responded to Turk's transmission yet. Hall had no confirmation they'd even received it. She had 23,000 francs and no access to more, but she needed Lyon to agree, and she'd solve the money problem later. She'd been solving impossible problems for 18 months. This was just another one. Lyon studied her for a long moment. "The crossing takes 2 days, maybe 3 if weather is bad. We walk at night to avoid patrols. The path climbs to 2,400 meters altitude. There are places where you climb with your hands, places where a fall means death. If you can't continue, I leave you. I don't risk my life for people who can't keep pace."
Understood. And if the Germans catch us, you don't know my name, you never saw me, you were walking alone. Agreed. I'll leave on November 8th, 2 days from now. That gives you time to prepare. Bring warm clothing, boots with good grip, food for 3 days, water, no suitcases, 1 small pack only. And bring the money. I'll verify it before we start. Hall nodded, and Lyon moved to the door, then paused. Why are the Germans looking for you? Because I've been causing them problems. The prison breaks, the supply drops, the networks in Lyon. It wasn't a question. People talk about the limping lady. I didn't believe it was real. I thought it was a legend. It's real. Lyon almost smiled. Then maybe you can walk the mountains after all. People who cause problems for Germans are usually tougher than they look. He left. Hall sat on the bench for another 10 minutes, watching the ducks, thinking through logistics. 50 miles over the Pyrenees, in November, with a wooden leg that already caused pain during normal walking and would be catastrophic on steep mountain terrain, in snow, at altitude, with German patrols on the French side and Spanish authorities on the other side who would arrest her and potentially hand her back to the Germans. The rational choice was to stay in Lyon, operate more carefully, rebuild the network from a more secure position. But rational choices assumed the Gestapo didn't already have her description, didn't already know about the wooden leg, weren't already offering enough money to make every collaborator in Lyon interested in finding her. She'd been invisible for 18 months. The wooden leg had been perfect cover. Who suspects a cripple? But now the Germans knew. The disability that had protected her was now a targeting marker. Every time she walked down the street, the distinctive limp identified her to anyone who'd seen the poster. The wooden leg had become a death sentence.
November 8, 1942, 22:30 hours, outside Perpignan. The group assembled at a farmhouse 7 kilometers south of Perpignan, in the foothills, where the flat coastal plain began its rise toward the Pyrenees. 9 people. Hall, Lyon, 3 British RAF airmen shot down over France in October, a Belgian resistance fighter wanted for sabotage, 2 young French Jews fleeing deportation, and a Polish officer who'd escaped from a POW camp. None of them knew each other's real names. None of them asked questions. Lyon checked their packs, confiscated anything unnecessary. One of the RAF airmen had brought a full change of clothes. Lyon made him leave it. Every kilogram matters at altitude. You carry water, food, 1 blanket, nothing else. When he reached Hall, he examined her pack. Minimal clothing, concentrated food, a medical kit with extra bandages for her stump, and a leather pouch containing 38,000 francs, everything she had left. The money? Lyon asked quietly. Hall handed him the pouch. Half now, as agreed, the rest when we reach Spain. Lyon counted it. His expression darkened. This is 38,000 francs. You said 75,000. The rest is waiting with a contact in Barcelona. You'll receive it when I confirm safe arrival. You lied. I provided incentive. If you get me to Spain alive, you'll receive the full amount. If you abandon me in the mountains, you get nothing more. He stared at her. For a moment, Hall thought he'd refuse, send her back, leave her to the Gestapo. Then he pocketed the money. If you fall behind, you're on your own. I won't fall behind. At 23:15 hours, the group began walking. The first 6 kilometers were easy, relatively flat terrain, dirt paths, darkness concealing them from any observers. Hall's wooden leg handled it without difficulty. She'd walked farther than this countless times in Lyon. But at 01:40 hours on November 9th, the terrain changed. The path began to climb. 15 degrees, then 20, then steeper. The dirt gave way to rocks and roots. The wooden leg, which pivoted on a simple hinge joint, couldn't flex naturally with the terrain. Each step required Hall to compensate, to throw her weight differently, to use her right leg and arms to balance what the left leg couldn't do naturally. At 03:20 hours, they stopped for a 10-minute rest.
Hall's stump was bleeding inside the prosthetic. She could feel the wetness, the sharp pain where the leather straps had rubbed the skin raw. She said nothing, adjusted the straps, kept walking when Lyon signaled. By 0500 hours, they'd climbed to approximately 800 meters altitude. The temperature had dropped to near freezing. Hall's breath came in visible clouds. The wooden leg was increasingly difficult to control on the steep, uneven ground. At 0630 hours, dawn began to break. Lyon led them off the path into a dense section of forest and signaled to stop. "We rest here until nightfall," he said. "No fires, no noise. German patrols use the valleys during the day." The group collapsed into exhausted silence. Hall found a tree to lean against, extended the wooden leg to relieve pressure, and felt the stump throbbing with each heartbeat. They'd covered maybe 12 kilometers, mostly flat terrain with moderate climbing. They had 70 kilometers to go, most of it at high altitude, through snow and ice, over passes that would make the first night's walk look trivial. And the wooden leg was already failing.
November 9, 1942. 1940 hours. 1,200 meters altitude. They resumed walking at dusk. The temperature had dropped to -2 degrees Celsius. The path had disappeared entirely. Now they were following Lyon through forest and over rock fields, climbing steadily toward the high passes. Hall's stump had stopped bleeding, but the skin was raw in 3 places where the leather straps made contact. She'd applied bandages during the day rest, wrapped the stump in extra cloth to cushion the pressure. It helped for approximately 40 minutes. Then the pain returned, sharper than before. At 21:15 hours, they reached a stream. Fast-moving water, half frozen, approximately 4 meters across. Lyon crossed first, stepping on rocks that barely broke the surface, using his walking stick for balance. The others followed one by one. The Belgian resistance fighter slipped halfway across, caught himself, scrambled to the far bank soaking wet. The cold would make his crossing more dangerous. Wet clothing at altitude in November could mean hypothermia within hours. Hall approached the stream and immediately saw the problem. The crossing required balance, flexibility, the ability to shift weight quickly from one foot to the other across unstable rocks. The wooden leg couldn't do that. She stepped onto the first rock. Her right leg took her weight. She swung the wooden leg forward to the second rock. The prosthetic landed at an angle, didn't flex, threw her balance off. She caught herself with her arms, steadied, tried again. Second rock, weight on the wooden leg now. The prosthetic didn't grip properly on the wet surface. She felt it sliding. She threw her weight forward desperately, reaching for the third rock. Her right foot landed. The wooden leg swung through air, hit the water. The cold was instant and shocking. Not just the temperature, the force of the current pushing against the rigid wooden leg, trying to sweep it downstream, pulling her off balance. She windmilled her arms, overcorrected, felt herself tipping backward toward the water. A hand grabbed her arm. One of the RAF airmen, still on the bank behind her, had seen her struggling and stepped out to help. Together they made it across. Hall reached the far bank, gasping, wooden legs streaming water, the leather straps now soaked and beginning to freeze. Lyon watched without expression. "Can you continue?" Hall nodded, not trusting her voice. They climbed. By 2300 hours, the wooden leg had frozen partially. Ice was forming on the metal joints, making them stiffer. Each step required more effort. The prosthetic no longer swung naturally. Hall had to throw it forward with her hip, plant it, shift weight, repeat. The group's pace slowed to match hers. She could feel their frustration, even though no one spoke. At 045 hours on November 10th, they reached 1,600 meters altitude. The trees had thinned. The wind picked up, cutting through clothing, dropping the effective temperature to -8 degrees. And they encountered the first snow. Not falling snow,
Old snow, packed and frozen on the ground, covering the rocks and creating a surface that was simultaneously slippery and uneven. The wooden leg punched through the snow crust with each step, sinking 15 to 20 centimeters before hitting solid ground. Hall had to pull it free, swing it forward, punch through again. The effort was 3 times what normal walking required. Her right leg, the real leg, the one doing most of the work, was beginning to cramp. The muscles in her thigh burned. Her breathing was labored, partly from exertion, partly from altitude. At 0130 hours, Lyon called another rest. 5 minutes. The group collapsed where they stood. Hall sat on a rock and examined the wooden leg by moonlight. The leather straps were frozen stiff. The metal hinge joint had ice buildup that restricted movement. The carved wood itself was intact, but the attachment point where her stump fit into the prosthetic was lined with leather that was now frozen, stiff, and uncomfortable. Nothing she could do about that except wait for body heat to soften it once she put the leg back on. Hall wrapped the prosthetic in her blanket to keep it dry and protect it from further freezing. Then she leaned back against the cave wall and closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. The pain in her stump wouldn't allow it, but she rested, conserving energy, preparing for the night ahead. November 10th, 1925 hours, 1,850 meters altitude. They resumed at dusk. The temperature had dropped to -5 degrees Celsius, and the wind was stronger at this altitude, a constant 25-kilometer-per-hour push from the northwest that cut through clothing and made every exposed surface ache.
Hall had reattached the wooden leg. The stump wounds screamed when the leather made contact, but there was no alternative. She wrapped the attachment points with extra cloth, pulled the straps tight enough to secure the prosthetic, but not so tight she cut off circulation, and stood. The group climbed. For the first hour, the terrain was similar to the previous night, steep, snow-covered, requiring constant attention to footing. Hall managed it through sheer determination, falling into a rhythm. Plant the wooden leg, shift weight, swing the right leg forward, repeat. Don't think about the pain, don't think about the distance remaining, just the next step. At 20:45 hours, they reached 2,100 meters altitude and the terrain changed again. The path, such as it was, now traversed a steep slope, not climbing directly upward but angling across the face of the mountain with a 40-degree drop to the left. The snow was deeper here, 30 to 40 centimeters, and underneath it was not solid ground but loose scree, small rocks that shifted and slid when weight was applied. Lyon stopped the group. Single file. Stay close to the rock wall on the right. If you fall to the left, you won't stop rolling until you hit the valley floor. That's 400 meters down. They proceeded slowly. Lyon first, then the RAF airmen, then the Belgian, then the Jews, then the Polish officer. Hall went last. If she fell, she wouldn't take anyone else with her. Each step was a negotiation. The wooden leg would punch through the snow, hit the scree underneath, and the rocks would shift. Hall would freeze, wait to see if the ground held, then commit her weight. Sometimes it held. Sometimes the rocks slid 6 inches before catching on something stable. At 21:50 hours, halfway across the traverse, the damaged leather strap finally gave way. Hall felt it happen, a sudden loosening, the prosthetic shifting wrong, her weight distribution collapsing. She grabbed for the rock wall, fingers scraping stone, body tilting toward the 400-meter drop. The wooden leg detached. Not completely, one strap was still holding, but enough that the prosthetic was no longer properly supporting her weight. It swung loose, attached only at the top of the thigh, the foot portion dangling uselessly. Hall was pressed against the rock wall, arms spread, right leg bearing all her weight on unstable scree, left leg useless. She couldn't move forward, she couldn't move backward. The scree under her right foot was already sliding slowly down slope. Ahead of her, the Polish officer noticed she'd stopped. He turned, saw the situation, and immediately understood. "Don't move," he said quietly, then louder to Lyon, "We have a problem." The group stopped. Lyon worked his way back along the traverse until he reached Hall. He looked at the broken strap,
at her position, at the drop to the left. "Can you reattach it?" "Not here. I need stable ground in both hands. If I let go of the wall, I fall." Lyon studied the situation. "How far can you go with one leg?" "On flat ground with support, maybe a few meters. On this slope, I can't." The group was silent. The wind howled. Hall felt the scree continuing to shift beneath her right foot, grain by grain, sliding toward the edge. She'd survived 18 months in occupied France, organized 3 prison breaks, evaded the Gestapo, walked out of Lyon with the entire German intelligence apparatus searching for her, and now she was going to die on a mountainside because a leather strap broke. Lyon moved closer, testing each foothold carefully. "I'm going to brace you. You're going to sit down against the wall. Fix the strap, then we continue. The scree won't hold both our weights. Then we do it fast." He positioned himself next to her, back against the rock wall, walking stick jammed into the snow as an anchor point. "On 3. You sit, I brace. 1, 2, 3. Hall dropped, bending her right leg, lowering herself toward the ground. Lyon grabbed her shoulders, took some of her weight, pressed her back against the wall. The scree under them slid 15 centimeters. Hall's heart rate spiked to 160 beats per minute, but her hands were steady. She pulled the wooden leg around, examined the broken strap in the moonlight. The tear was complete. The strap had separated entirely, but the leather was still long enough to tie. She worked fast, removed the remnants of the broken strap from the buckle, tied the 2 ends together using a square knot reinforced with a surgeon's knot, the kind of knot that wouldn't slip under tension, pulled it tight, tested it. The knot held. She repositioned the prosthetic, fit her stump into the attachment cup, secured the repaired strap and the one remaining intact strap, and pulled them as tight as she could manage. Done. Lyon helped her stand. The repaired strap held, the prosthetic was secure, but the knot added bulk that pressed into her thigh, and the strap was now shorter. The prosthetic fit differently, distributing weight in new places. Hall took 1 step. Pain flared where the knot dug into her leg. She took another step. The pain was manageable. Barely. "Can you continue?" asked Lyon. Hall looked at the traverse ahead. Another 50 meters of unstable slope before the path turned upward toward stable ground. Then the climb to Col de la Perche. Then the descent on the Spanish side. Maybe 40 more kilometers. With a prosthetic held together with a knotted strap and prayers. "Yes," she said. They continued. The traverse took another 40 minutes. Every step was agony. The repaired strap held, but the knot created a pressure point that felt like a knife blade pressing into her thigh. Hall focused on breathing, on the next handhold, on not looking at the drop to her left. At 22:37 hours, they reached the end of the traverse and solid ground. The path turned upward again, climbing toward the pass. Hall allowed herself 10 seconds of relief. Then she kept walking. November 10th, 1942, 03:15 hours, 2,380 meters altitude. They reached Col de la Perche just after 300 hours. The pass was a narrow gap between 2 peaks, wind-scoured and barren, with snow packed so hard it was essentially ice. From here, the path descended into Spain, 40 kilometers of downhill terrain through snow and forest, avoiding Spanish border patrols, until they reached the town of Figueres, where Republican sympathizers would hide them until they could reach Barcelona. Downhill should have been easier.
But for Hall, descending was worse. The wooden leg couldn't flex naturally at the ankle. Going downhill meant each step jarred the prosthetic, driving the attachment cup against her stump, hitting the open wounds, sending spikes of pain up her leg. And the repaired strap was loosening. The knot was holding, but the constant stress was stretching the leather. The prosthetic was shifting with each step, requiring constant adjustment. At 04:45 hours, descending through forest at approximately 2,100 meters altitude, Hall's right leg, the real leg that had been compensating for the prosthetic's limitations for 2 days, began to fail. The cramping she'd felt earlier returned, worse now. Her thigh muscles seized, a sudden contraction that locked the leg rigid and sent her crashing into the snow.
She lay there for 10 seconds, waiting for the cramp to release. It didn't. The Polish officer helped her sit up. "What's wrong?" "Cramp, right leg." He understood immediately. He'd seen men get leg cramps during forced marches in the army. Dehydration, exhaustion, muscle fatigue. "You need water and salt." Hall's canteen was nearly empty, maybe 200 milliliters remaining. She drank half of it, forcing herself to save the rest. The Polish officer produced a small piece of dried sausage from his pack and gave it to her. "Salt. Eat." She ate. The cramp began to ease after 2 minutes, releasing slowly, leaving the muscles sore and weak. At 0450 hours, she stood and continued walking. By 0600 hours, dawn was breaking again. They'd descended to approximately 1900 meters altitude. Spain was close, maybe 25 kilometers remaining. But Hall could barely walk. The right leg was weak and threatening to cramp again. The left leg, the wooden leg, was held together by a knotted strap that was stretching with every step. The stump underneath was bleeding again. She could feel it. Lyon led them off the path to another hiding spot, this time a dense section of pine forest that provided concealment and some shelter from the wind. The group collapsed. Everyone was exhausted. The Belgian fighter's wet clothing had given him mild frostbite on 3 toes. One of the RAF airmen had twisted an ankle. The younger French Jew was showing signs of altitude sickness, nausea, headache, confusion. They were falling apart, and they still had to reach Figueres, evade Spanish patrols, and find the Republican contacts who could hide them. Hall removed the wooden leg and examined it. The repaired strap was stretched 2 centimeters longer than when she'd tied it. The knot was holding, but barely. Maybe 6 more hours of walking, maybe less. The second strap, the one that hadn't broken, showed a new tear forming. Small, barely visible, but present. It would fail next. Hall had no more leather to repair it, no more cloth that was strong enough. If the second strap broke, the prosthetic would be unusable. She would be unable to walk. 25 kilometers from safety, in Spanish territory where she'd be arrested on sight as an illegal border crosser, with no way to prove she was an Allied intelligence officer and not a refugee or spy. Her SOE identity papers were fake, meant for France, useless in Spain. Lyon sat beside her, looked at the prosthetic, looked at her face. "Can you make it?" he asked. Hall wrapped the stump in fresh bandages, applied pressure to stop the bleeding. "I have to." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." Lyon was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've taken 40 people over these mountains. British, French, Polish, Belgian, American. Some were injured, some were sick, some were old, but I've never taken anyone across with one leg." "Am I the slowest you've guided?" "No. There was a British pilot with a broken rib who could barely breathe. Took him 4 days, but he had 2 legs." "Will you leave me if I can't keep pace tonight?" Lyon didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched. "No," he said finally. "You've made it this far. You'll make it the rest of the way, even if I have to carry you." Hall almost smiled. "I don't think your back could handle carrying me and Cuthbert." "Cuthbert?" "The leg. I named it." Lyon did smile then. "You're insane." "Probably." He stood. "Rest. We leave at dusk. 1 more night. Then Spain, then Barcelona, then you're someone else's problem." Hall wrapped the stump in fresh bandages, applied pressure to stop the bleeding. She leaned back against a tree and closed her eyes. 1 more night. 25 kilometers. On a prosthetic held together by a knotted strap and the stubborn refusal to die on a mountainside. She'd survived worse odds. She hoped.
November 11th, 1942. 1915 hours. 1,900 meters altitude. They began the final descent as darkness fell. The moon was 3/4 full, providing enough light to navigate, but also making them visible to any patrols watching the border approaches. Hall had rewrapped her stump with the last of her bandages, pulled the leather straps as tight as she could manage, and tested the wooden leg's weight distribution. The repaired strap with its knot was holding, but the leather had stretched another centimeter during the day's rest. The prosthetic shifted noticeably with each step. The second strap, the one showing the new tear, was her primary concern. She'd reinforced it with strips of cloth torn from her blanket, wrapping them around the leather to distribute the stress. It might buy her a few hours, maybe. For the first hour, they descended through pine forest on a relatively gentle slope. Hall managed a rhythm. Wooden leg forward, brace with walking stick, shift weight carefully, bring right leg down, repeat. The key was never putting full weight on the prosthetic during the moment of impact. At 20-30 hours, they reached a stream running fast with snowmelt, not frozen like the higher altitudes, but cold enough to cause immediate numbness. Lyon crossed first, then helped the others. When Hall's turn came, she knew the wooden leg wouldn't manage the rock hopping required. "I'll wade through," she said. "The current is strong, you'll be swept." Hall was already moving. She stepped directly into the stream, wooden leg first. The water hit mid-thigh, shockingly cold, the current immediately pushing against the rigid prosthetic. She planted her walking stick upstream as an anchor and pushed forward. 3 steps. 4. The stream bed was rocky and uneven. The wooden leg slipped on moss-covered stones. She caught herself with the stick, kept moving. Halfway across, the current caught the wooden leg fully, spinning it sideways. The torque transferred up through the straps to her stump. She felt something tear, not the leather, but skin, fresh blood inside the attachment cup. She reached the far bank, gasping, teeth chattering, the wooden leg streaming water that would freeze within minutes in the night air. They kept moving. At 21:45 hours, approximately 1,600 meters altitude, Lyon stopped them. He pointed down the mountain. "See the lights?" Far below, maybe 5 kilometers away, scattered lights marked a settlement. "That's Camprodan, Spanish town. We go around it, through the forest, then follow the river valley to Moyo. From there, back roads to Figueras, if we're not caught." "Patrols?" the Polish officer asked. "Guardia Civil, Spanish border police. They patrol the main paths. We take the smugglers' routes. Quieter, more difficult." Hall looked at the terrain ahead. The more difficult route wound along a steep hillside, through dense forest, over exposed rock faces. In daylight with 2 good legs, it would be challenging. At night, with a failing prosthetic, it would be nearly impossible. But the alternative was Spanish prison, interrogation, and probable return to German custody. At 22:15 hours, descending through thick undergrowth at approximately 1,400 meters altitude, the second leather strap began to fail. Hall felt it happen gradually, a slight loosening with each step, the prosthetic rotating a few degrees more than normal, the attachment cup no longer holding firmly against her stump. She stopped, braced against a tree, and examined the strap by moonlight filtering through the canopy. The tear had lengthened. The cloth reinforcement was holding, but the leather underneath had split almost halfway through. Every step was making it worse. "Problem?" Lyon asked, doubling back. Hall showed him the strap. His face darkened. "How long will it hold?" "Maybe an hour, maybe less. We're 8 kilometers from the river valley. Once we reach it, the terrain is flat, easier walking." 8 kilometers of this terrain? The strap won't make it. Lyon looked around, assessing options. "Can you slide down, use the slopes, control your descent with your arms and good leg? And destroy my hands and remaining leg on the rocks? Then I can't walk at all." The rest of the group had stopped, watching. The RAF airman looked concerned. The Polish fighter was shivering again, his energy reserves depleted. The 2 French Jews were holding each other up, exhausted. They were all at their limits. Hall's prosthetic failure would doom not just her, but potentially the entire group if they had to slow down or carry her. "Give me 5 minutes," Hall said. "Let me try something." She sat on a relatively flat rock and removed the wooden leg completely. The stump underneath was a mess, blood seeping through the bandages, swelling making the flesh tight and discolored. But that wasn't her concern now. She examined the prosthetic's construction. The wooden leg itself was solid oak, carved to approximate the shape of a lower leg and foot. The attachment cup at the top was leather-lined wood with 2 metal rings where the straps threaded through. The straps were the failure point, but the structure was sound. Hall pulled out her belt, thick leather, good quality, one of the few decent items she'd maintained throughout the war. She threaded it through the metal rings where the straps attached. The belt was just long enough to wrap around her upper thigh and buckle. It wouldn't provide the same distributed support as the 2 straps. All the weight would concentrate on one pressure point. The pain would be excruciating, but it would hold. She fitted her stump back into the cup, wrapped the belt around her thigh as high as possible to avoid the worst of the wounds, and pulled it tight. The pressure was immediate and intense, the narrow belt cutting into her leg like a tourniquet. She stood, tested the weight. The prosthetic held, but every movement sent sharp pains through her thigh where the belt concentrated the pressure. "It works?" Lyon asked. Hall took a step. The pain spiked. She took another step, still holding. "It works." They continued descending. November 11th, 1942, 23:40 hours, 1,200 meters altitude. The belt solution held for 90 minutes. During that time, Hall descended 400 vertical meters through forest, across 2 more streams, and down a particularly treacherous scree slope where everyone, even those with 2 good legs, struggled to maintain footing. The pain was constant now. The belt had cut off circulation to parts of her thigh. She could feel the tissue dying, going numb, then burning as blood forced its way through compressed vessels. The stump was bleeding freely. She could feel the warmth running down inside the prosthetic, but she kept moving. At 23:40 hours, they reached a rock face, not quite a cliff, but a 70-degree slope of exposed granite, 30 meters high, that had to be descended to reach the valley floor below. "There's a route," Lyon said, pointing to a series of ledges and handholds. "Face the rock, climb down backwards, test each hold before committing weight." One by one, the group descended, slow, careful, methodical. The Polish officer went first, finding the stable holds, calling up guidance to the others. Hall went last.
She turned to face the rock, lowered herself over the edge, right foot finding the first ledge. The wooden leg followed, but it couldn't feel the ledge, couldn't adjust to the surface. She had to look down, position it by sight, hope it would hold. 5 meters down, the wooden leg slipped off its ledge. The sudden drop pulled the belt tight against her thigh. She felt tissue tear. Hot liquid, blood, ran down her leg. She hung by her arms for 3 seconds, right leg scrambling for purchase, wooden leg swinging free. Her right foot found a hold. She pulled the wooden leg up, repositioned it, continued down. 10 meters. 15. Her arms were shaking. Her right leg was cramping again. The wooden leg was now slick with blood that had run down from her thigh, making the surface slippery. 20 meters. The belt was loosening. Not breaking. Leather that thick wouldn't break, but the blood was making it slip through the buckle. Millimeter by millimeter, extending with each movement. 25 meters. Hall felt the exact moment the belt slipped free. The buckle released. The wooden leg detached completely. It fell, clattering against the rock face, bouncing twice before landing in the undergrowth below. Hall was hanging by her arms, one leg dangling uselessly 8 meters from the ground. Her choices were simple: fall and probably break her remaining leg, or climb down one-legged and probably fall anyway. She climbed. Right foot to the next ledge, arms lowering her body. The stump of her left leg scraped against the rock, sending lightning bolts of pain through her nervous system. She ignored it. 6 meters from the ground. Her arms were failing. Muscles pushed beyond exhaustion, beyond their capacity to contract. She could feel her grip weakening on the handholds. 4 meters.
The Polish officer was below her now, arms raised. "Jump! I'll catch you!" Hall looked down, 4 meters onto uneven ground, caught by a man who might or might not be able to handle her weight falling from that height. If she landed wrong, broken ankle at minimum, broken leg more likely. But her arms gave her no choice. The muscles simply stopped responding. She let go. The fall took less than 2 seconds. The Polish officer caught her partially, redirecting her momentum, both of them crashing into the undergrowth. Hall's right leg hit the ground hard but intact. The stump of her left leg struck a rock, and she screamed, the first sound of pain she'd made during the entire crossing. Lyon was beside her immediately. "Are you hurt?" Hall tested her right leg, sore but functional. "I can stand." "Where's the leg?" The Belgian fighter had retrieved it, brought it over. The wooden prosthetic was undamaged, oak was hard to break, but without straps or a belt to attach it, it was just carved wood. "I can't walk without it," Lyon said. "Then we make it work," Lyon said. He pulled off his own belt, examined the prosthetic's attachment system. "We bind it directly to your leg, no cup, just the wood against your stump." "That won't work. The stump can't take direct pressure from raw wood." "Then we pad it." He looked at the group. "Everyone, spare clothing, now." The RAF airmen contributed undershirts. The Belgian fighter gave his scarf. The Polish officer provided spare socks. Within minutes, they'd created a thick padding of cloth. Hall looked at the improvised solution. It was absurd. Binding a wooden leg directly to her stump with belts and random clothing. It would be agony. It might not hold. It certainly wouldn't last long. But it might last 8 kilometers. She wrapped her stump in the collected cloth, creating as much cushioning as possible. Then she positioned the wooden leg against it, and Lyon wrapped his belt around both, pulling it tight. The Polish officer added his belt lower down, creating a second attachment point. Hall stood. The pain was unlike anything she'd experienced. Without the attachment cup to distribute weight, every bit of pressure concentrated on her stump. The cloth padding helped, but not enough. Each step felt like standing on broken glass. But she could walk. Sort of. Lyon said the valley is that way, pointing through the trees. 2 kilometers to the river, then 6 kilometers of flat ground to Moyo. Hall nodded and started walking. November 12th, 1942, 01:30 a.m., near Moyo, Spain. They reached the Valley River just after midnight. The terrain flattened as Lyon had promised, becoming a dirt path along the river. Easy walking for everyone except Hall, whose improvised leg attachment was failing with each step. The belts were sliding. The cloth padding was compressing, providing less protection. The wooden leg was rotating slightly with each step because the binding wasn't rigid enough. But she kept walking. 1 kilometer, 2, 3. At 2:15 hours, they heard engines. "Patrol," Lyon hissed, into the trees. The group scrambled off the path into dense undergrowth. Hall moved too slowly, the wooden leg caught on roots, the unstable binding making quick movement impossible. Headlights appeared around a bend 100 meters away. A truck, moving slowly, searchlights sweeping the sides of the road. Hall was still 5 meters from concealment. She dropped flat, pressing herself into the dirt path, hoping the darkness and her dark clothing would hide her. The truck approached, stopped 20 meters away. 2 Guardia Civil officers got out, carrying rifles. They walked forward, flashlights probing the darkness. Hall held perfectly still, face in the dirt, not breathing. The flashlight beam passed over her once, twice, paused. One of the officers said something in Spanish. The other responded. They stood there for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Then they returned to the truck, started the engine, continued down the road.
Hall waited until the sound faded completely before moving. When she tried to stand, the wooden leg wouldn't support her. The belts had loosened too much during the sudden drop to the ground. The Polish officer and one of the RAF airmen had to lift her, support her, while Lyon retightened the belts. 4 more kilometers, Lyon said. Hall wanted to laugh, or cry, or both. 4 kilometers might as well have been 40. The wooden leg was barely functional. Her stump was destroyed. Her right leg was cramping intermittently. Her energy reserves were gone. But the alternative was capture by Spanish authorities who would intern her, interrogate her, possibly return her to France where the Gestapo was still hunting the limping lady. So she walked. One step, another, another. At 0340 hours, they reached the outskirts of Moyo. Lyon led them around the town through fields and back paths. Dogs barked at their passage, but no lights came on. At 0425 hours, they reached a farmhouse 2 kilometers past Moyo. Lyon knocked. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS in Morse code. The door opened. A man in his 50s, unshaven, wearing work clothes despite the early hour. 9 packages, Lyon said in Spanish. Bring them in, the man replied. Hall made it 3 steps into the farmhouse before collapsing. The wooden leg finally detached completely, rolling away across the floor. She lay on rough wooden planks, unable to move, unable to speak, feeling her body shut down system by system. The man looked at her, at the wooden leg, at the blood soaking through the improvised bandaging. Jesus Christ, he said in accented English. What happened to her? She walked over the Pyrenees, Lyon said, on one leg. That's impossible. Tell her that. The man knelt beside Hall, checked her pulse. She needs a doctor. No doctors, Hall managed to say. Too risky. You need medical attention or you'll lose that leg. The real one, I mean. Hall almost laughed. After everything, the thought of losing her remaining leg had a dark absurdity to it. Basic first aid. Clean water, bandages. I'll manage. The man shook his head but didn't argue. He helped carry her to a back room, away from windows. The wife appeared with a basin of warm water, clean cloth, and a half-empty bottle of local spirits that would serve as disinfectant. Hall spent the next hour cleaning and bandaging her stump. The damage was extensive. Multiple lacerations, severe bruising, 2 areas where the tissue was clearly dead from prolonged pressure. Without proper medical treatment, infection was likely. With proper treatment, recovery would take weeks. She had neither proper treatment nor weeks. At 0600 hours, Lyon returned to the room. Transportation is arranged. Tomorrow night, a truck to Figueres. From there, a train to Barcelona. Do you have contacts in Barcelona? The American consulate, Hall said. They'll ask how you entered Spain. I'll tell them I'm a journalist who got caught on the wrong side of the border. With those injuries, they'll know you crossed the mountains. Then they'll know I really wanted to get out of France. Lyon sat on a wooden chair, studied her. The money. You promised another 37,000 francs. Hall met his eyes. I lied. I don't have it. I never did. She expected anger. Instead, Lyon smiled. I know, he said. I knew when you handed me less than half in Perpignan. But I'd heard about the limping lady, the organizer, the one causing problems for the Nazis. I figured anyone the Nazis wanted that badly was worth helping. So you risked your life for free? Not free. You paid 38,000. That's more than most can pay. And you made it across the mountains when I was certain you'd die trying. That's worth something. He stood to leave, then paused. What will you do now? Hall looked at the wooden leg propped in the corner, broken straps dangling, bloodstains on the wood. Get a new leg. Go back to work. Back to France. Back to killing Nazis. Lyon nodded. The limping lady lives. She does. He left. Hall closed her eyes and let exhaustion take her. She'd walked 50 miles over the Pyrenees in November with a wooden leg. The prosthetic had failed completely. She'd improvised solutions that shouldn't have worked. She survived when survival was mathematically improbable. And 6 months later, she'd be back in France with a new prosthetic, organizing resistance networks and coordinating sabotage operations for D-Day. The Germans had forced her to flee. They'd driven her over mountains that should have killed her. They failed. The limping lady had escaped. November 30th, 1942, Barcelona, Spain. Virginia Hall spent 2 weeks recovering in a safe house in Barcelona before the American consulate arranged her evacuation. The Spanish authorities knew she'd entered illegally, but chose not to investigate too closely. The Americans were promising increased grain shipments to Spain, and one limping woman wasn't worth jeopardizing that arrangement. The stump had become infected, as she'd expected. A Republican doctor who asked no questions treated her with sulfa drugs stolen from a military hospital. He told her she was lucky to keep the leg. She told him luck had nothing to do with it. On November 30th, she boarded a ship for Lisbon, then a flight to London on a Portuguese airliner. She arrived at SOE headquarters on Baker Street on December 4th, 1942, 15 months after she'd last seen it. The duty officer didn't recognize her. She'd lost 18 pounds. Her face was gaunt. She walked with a cane because the wooden leg was held together with rope and wire. "I need to see Colonel Buckmaster," she said. "Do you have an appointment?" "Tell him Diane is back from the field." The duty officer's eyes widened. Everyone at Baker Street knew about Diane, the American woman who'd run the Lyon networks, organized prison breaks, and escaped over the Pyrenees with the entire Gestapo hunting her. Buckmaster saw her immediately. He looked at her appearance, the makeshift prosthetic, the cane, and said, "Good God, Virginia, the reports didn't do justice to what you went through." "The reports were accurate," Hall said. "I need a new leg and I need to go back." "Back? To France? Absolutely not. The Germans have your description. The limping lady is known from Paris to Marseille. You'd be arrested within days." "Not if I go back differently. Different identity, different appearance, different organization." "Virginia, you've done more than anyone could ask. I've earned the right to finish what I started," Hall interrupted. "The invasion is coming. Everyone knows it. France needs organizers. I know the terrain, the people, the language. A new leg and a new cover, and I can go back." Buckmaster shook his head. "Even if I agreed, which I don't, the Gestapo knows about your disability. Any woman with a limp will draw scrutiny. Then I'll learn to walk without a limp." "That's impossible. The prosthetic." "Get me a better prosthetic, the newest design. I'll train until I can walk normally, or normally enough." Buckmaster studied her for a long moment. "The Americans are expanding their intelligence operations, the Office of Strategic Services. They're recruiting experienced agents. Perhaps arrange a meeting," Hall said. March 21st, 1944, Scotland. Hall spent 3 months learning to walk again. The new prosthetic was revolutionary, designed in 1943 for wounded veterans using an aluminum shin instead of wood, improved joint mechanics, and a suction socket that distributed weight more evenly. It weighed 6 pounds instead of 8. The ankle joint had limited flexibility, allowing more natural movement. But it still required extensive training to use properly, especially for someone trying to minimize a limp. Hall trained at Special Training School 25 in Scotland, a remote facility where SOE and OSS prepared agents for insertion into occupied Europe. 6 hours a day, she walked. On level ground, on stairs, on rough terrain, up hills, down hills, carrying weight, moving quickly, moving slowly. She studied her gait in mirrors, analyzing each movement. The left leg, the prosthetic, wanted to swing differently than the right. She compensated by shortening her stride, keeping her hips level, rolling through the prosthetic foot instead of letting it slap down. By February 1944, she could walk 100 meters without an observable limp if she concentrated. By March, she could maintain the normalized gait for a full kilometer. It required constant attention and muscular compensation that exhausted her, but it was possible. The OSS was eager to employ her. They'd heard about her SOE operations, her escape, her networks. They offered her a desk position in London, analyzing intelligence and training new agents. She refused. "I go back to France or I don't work for you," she told Colonel James Forgan, head of OSS operations in Europe. "The Germans are still looking for the limping lady. Then I won't limp."
You can't hide a prosthetic leg through a thorough search. Then I won't get searched thoroughly. Forgan finally agreed, with conditions. New identity, she would be Marcel Montagne, a French-American farm worker. New appearance, she learned to dye her hair gray, wear peasant clothing, speak with a rural accent. New area of operations, not Lyon, but the Haute-Loire department, rural countryside where she could organize resistance groups without the urban surveillance of cities. Most importantly, new mission parameters. She wasn't building long-term networks this time. She was preparing for invasion, training resistance fighters in sabotage, coordinating supply drops, preparing to disrupt German movements when Allied forces landed. On March 21, 1944, a British motor torpedo boat deposited her on a beach near Le Guilvinec in Brittany. She wore rough farm clothing, carried identity papers showing 3 years of agricultural work, and walked up the beach without limping. The limping lady was dead. Marcel Montagne had arrived. May 15, 1944, Haute-Loire Department, Central France. Hall established herself in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, a village that had been hiding Jewish refugees throughout the war. The Protestant population there had a long history of resistance to authority, dating back to the persecution of Huguenots. They asked no questions about the middle-aged farm woman who walked a bit stiffly and spoke French with a slight accent. Within 6 weeks, she'd organized 4 separate resistance groups, totaling 300 fighters. They called themselves the Diane Irregulars. She'd kept her code name even with her new identity. The groups were different from her Lyon networks. These were rural fighters, farmers, shepherds, woodcutters. They knew the terrain intimately. They could disappear into forests and hills where German patrols couldn't follow, but they lacked training, weapons, and coordination. Hall fixed all 3 problems. Using her OSS radio, more advanced than the SOE equipment, with better range and encryption, she coordinated 17 supply drops between April and May. Each drop brought Sten guns, ammunition, plastic explosives, and instructional materials translated into French. She trained the fighters herself, teaching skills she'd learned in SOE schools. How to derail a train with 18 ounces of plastic explosive placed at a rail joint, how to destroy a telephone junction box to cut German communications, how to ambush a convoy using the terrain to channel vehicles into kill zones. The new prosthetic held up better than Cuthbert ever had. The aluminum didn't absorb water. The improved socket reduced skin damage. The ankle joint handled rough terrain more naturally. But she still had to be careful. Walking normally required concentration she couldn't maintain during long operations. When tired, the limp returned. When carrying weight, it was obvious. When moving quickly, impossible. So, she adapted. She traveled by bicycle when possible. Pedaling used different muscles, and the prosthetic was less noticeable. She scheduled meetings for early morning when she was rested and could maintain her gait. She kept interactions with German forces minimal, operating through intermediaries.
On May 15, she received a coded message from London. Neptune imminent. Activate all groups. Maximum disruption required. Neptune was the code name for the Normandy invasion. Imminent meant days, not weeks. Hall transmitted activation codes to all 4 resistance groups. Within 48 hours, they would begin systematic attacks on German infrastructure across the Haute-Loire department. June 6, 1944, D-Day. At 02:15 hours, Hall was positioned on a hillside overlooking the main railway line between Le Puy and Saint-Étienne. Below her, 5 resistance fighters were placing charges on the rails at 3 separate points over a 200-meter stretch. She'd planned this operation for 3 weeks. The railway was critical for moving German reinforcements north toward Normandy. Destroying it here, in a narrow valley with steep sides, would take weeks to repair. At 02:23 hours, the charges detonated simultaneously. The explosions shattered the night. Rails twisted into abstract sculptures. The roadbed collapsed into the stream bed below. A 200-meter section of track simply ceased to exist. Within 4 hours, German repair crews would arrive. They'd find the destroyed track,
They'd also find the secondary charges Hall's team had placed, designed to detonate when repair work began, and the tertiary charges hidden in the access roads, making it dangerous to bring in heavy equipment. The railway would be unusable for 17 days. Across the Haute-Loire, similar attacks were occurring. Telephone lines cut, bridges demolished, roads blocked with fallen trees embedded with mines. German units trying to move north found every route compromised, every communication line dead, every resupply point burning. Hall coordinated it all from a farmhouse outside Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, moving constantly to avoid German direction-finding units tracking her radio transmissions. On June 14, she watched from a distance as a German convoy, 15 trucks carrying infantry toward Normandy, entered a valley where her fighters had prepared an ambush. The lead truck hit a mine. As it burned, blocking the road, resistance fighters opened fire from concealed positions on both sides of the valley. The Germans, trapped between steep slopes with no cover, took devastating casualties. 12 trucks destroyed. An estimated 60 German soldiers killed or wounded. The survivors retreated south, away from Normandy. Hall felt no satisfaction, only cold calculation of the next operation. July 14, 1944, Bastille Day. The Germans were losing control of central France. The Normandy invasion had succeeded and Allied forces were pushing inland. French resistance groups, emboldened by the invasion and supplied by operations like Hall's, were attacking openly. But German intelligence was still hunting the organizers. They'd intercepted radio transmissions, they'd captured several resistance fighters, and extracted information through torture. They knew an American woman was operating in Haute-Loire, coordinating the attacks that had crippled their movements. They didn't know it was the limping lady. Hall's new identity and appearance had held. The gray hair, peasant clothing, and controlled gait had fooled every German patrol she'd encountered. But on July 14, her luck nearly ran out. She was meeting with a resistance leader in a cafe in Le Puy when 4 SS soldiers entered. Not a random patrol, they moved with purpose, checking papers systematically, comparing faces to photographs. Hall was 3 tables from the door. Her prosthetic was tired from a morning operation. If she stood and walked, the limp would be noticeable. She stayed seated, pulled out knitting from her bag, part of her cover as a farm woman, and focused on the needles. Just another middle-aged woman spending Bastille Day quietly. The SS soldiers reached her table. "Papers," said one in German-accented French. Hall handed her her identity card, Marcel Montagne, born 1908, agricultural worker. The paper was perfect. OSS forgers were exceptional. The soldiers studied it, looked at her face, looked at the photograph they were carrying. The photograph wasn't of her. It was a young woman, maybe 25, dark-haired. But the soldier kept staring at Hall. Something had caught his attention. "Stand up," he said. Hall's heart rate spiked to 140 beats per minute. If she stood, if she walked, if the limp showed, they'd investigate further. They might strip search her, find the prosthetic, make the connection to the limping lady. She stood slowly, as an older woman might, hand on the table for support. "Turn around." She turned, keeping her weight balanced, not taking a step. Walk to the wall and back. This was it, the moment when 18 months of operations would collapse because she couldn't hide a limp when exhausted. Hall took one step, concentrated on keeping her hips level, rolling through the prosthetic foot, natural arm swing. Second step, third, fourth. She reached the wall, turned, started back. Halfway back, her concentration slipped. The prosthetic foot didn't roll properly. It caught, creating a slight hitch in her gait. The SS soldier noticed. "You have an injury?" Hall's mind worked at maximum speed. Deny it, and he'd know she was hiding something. Admit it, and risk further investigation. "Farming accident," she said, letting a rural accent thicken her French. 1938, tractor rolled, crushed my foot. It heals, but never the same. Worse when weather changes. The soldier studied her. An old farming injury would explain a limp. It was plausible, common even. "Show me," he said. Hall sat, removed her right shoe, the real foot, and showed an old scar she'd acquired in Turkey during the hunting accident. The scar was on the wrong foot, but it was real, convincing. The soldier looked at it, nodded, handed back her papers. "You may go." Hall put on her shoe, gathered her knitting, and walked out of the cafe. She maintained the controlled gait for 100 meters until she was certain they couldn't see her, then let the limp return as she headed for the safe house.
That evening, she transmitted to London. Cover holding but degraded. Request extraction after liberation. London's response: negative. Maintain position. Your network's critical for final push. Hall burned the message and prepared for the next operation. August 25, 1944. Liberation of Paris. Hall listened to the radio reports of Paris's liberation from her position in Haute-Loire. The German garrison had surrendered. French forces and the population were celebrating in the streets. The war in France was effectively over, though fighting would continue in eastern regions. Her networks had played their part. The infrastructure damage across central France had delayed German reinforcements by crucial days. The systematic sabotage had forced Germans to guard every bridge, every rail line, every communication point, diluting their forces when concentration was critical. But Hall felt no celebration. She thought of the people who hadn't lived to see liberation. Jean Rousset, shot trying to escape using the blade she'd smuggled to him. The dozens of resistance fighters in her networks who'd been captured, tortured, executed. The Jewish families hidden in the Chambon-sur-Lignon who'd been discovered and deported in July. On September 22, 1944, Hall received orders to report to Paris for debriefing and reassignment. She'd been in the field continuously for 6 months, coordinating 400 resistance fighters, arranging 30 supply drops, and directing operations that killed an estimated 150 German soldiers and destroyed equipment worth millions of francs. The Germans never knew that Marcelle Montagne, the gray-haired farm woman with the slight limp, was the same limping lady they'd hunted out of Lyon in 1942. She'd returned to France with a new leg and a new identity. She'd organized, trained, and directed forces that helped ensure the success of D-Day. She'd survived when discovery meant certain death. And she'd done it all on an aluminum prosthetic that, while better than old Cuthbert, still caused pain with every step. September 27, 1944, Paris. Hall reported to OSS headquarters at 70 Avenue des Champs-Élysées, recently liberated from its German occupants. Colonel Forgan was waiting. "Extraordinary work," he said, reviewing her reports. 400 fighters organized, 30 supply drops coordinated, major infrastructure destroyed. You've earned any posting you want. London, Washington, name it. "I want to go to Austria," Hall said. Forgan looked surprised. "The war is not over there. It's still highly dangerous." "That's why I want to go." "Virginia, you've done enough. More than enough. You've been in the field for 3 years, with a 6-month break for the Pyrenees crossing and recovery," Hall said. "I can do more." "Your leg?" "My leg is fine. It's carried me this far." Forgan studied her. "The DSC is being prepared, the Distinguished Service Cross. You'll be the only civilian woman in the war to receive it. I don't want medals. I want to finish the job. The job is finished in France, but not in Europe." Forgan sighed. "I'll consider it. But first, take a week. Rest. Get medical attention for your leg. That's an order." Hall nodded, stood to leave. "Virginia," Forgan called after her, "the Germans put a price on your head. 50,000 Reichsmarks for the limping lady. Did you know that?" "I knew. They never caught you. Never even came close once you returned. They didn't know what to look for. They were hunting a limping woman. I learned not to limp." She walked out of the office, down the stairs, onto the Champs-Élysées where Free French forces were still celebrating. Her gait was controlled, even, showing no sign of the prosthetic leg that had carried her over the Pyrenees and through 2 invasions of occupied France. The limping lady had become legend. Virginia Hall had become something more.
May 1945, Innsbruck, Austria. Virginia Hall spent the final months of the war in Austria, operating behind enemy lines as German forces collapsed. She'd learned enough German during her years in Europe to pass as a displaced civilian, and the chaos of the collapsing Reich provided cover for intelligence operations. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Hall was in Innsbruck coordinating the surrender of a Waffen-SS unit to American forces. She'd spent 4 years operating in occupied territory. The war in Europe was over. But for Hall, the real war, the one she'd fought with a wooden leg and then an aluminum one, through French cities and over Spanish mountains, had ended the moment she walked off that Pyrenees mountainside. Everything after was epilogue. September 27, 1945, Washington, D.C. President Harry Truman presented Virginia Hall with the Distinguished Service Cross in a private ceremony at the White House. She'd requested no publicity, no photographers, no announcement. The only witnesses were her mother, the OSS director William Donovan, and a military aide. Truman read the citation. For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. Ms. Virginia Hall, civilian, displayed rare courage, exceptional resolve, and dedicated patriotism while serving behind enemy lines in France from March 1944 to September 1944. Despite a disability that would have excluded her from military service, she organized and directed resistance operations that materially aided the Allied invasion and liberation of France. The citation didn't mention the wooden leg, didn't mention the Pyrenees crossing, didn't mention that she'd been hunted by the Gestapo as the most dangerous Allied agent in France. Those details remained classified. Hall accepted the medal, shook the president's hand, and left without giving a statement. She was the only civilian woman in World War II to receive the Distinguished Service Cross. She never wore it. Central Intelligence Agency Headquarters, Washington, D.C. When the OSS dissolved in 1945 and reformed as the CIA in 1947, Hall was one of the first women hired as an intelligence officer. Not a secretary, not an analyst, an operational officer, despite regulations that technically prohibited women from such positions. She spent the early Cold War years running intelligence operations in Europe, using the same skills she'd developed fighting Germans. The prosthetic leg, she was on her third model by 1951, each one more advanced, still caused daily pain, but she never mentioned it, never used it as an excuse, never let it limit her operational planning. Younger CIA officers knew her only as the quiet woman who walked a bit stiffly and had an encyclopedic knowledge of European rail systems, resistance tactics, and clandestine communications. They didn't know she walked over the Pyrenees on a wooden leg. They didn't know the Gestapo had called her the most dangerous Allied agent in France. She preferred it that way. CIA mandatory retirement. The CIA forced Hall to retire at age 60, mandatory for women in operational positions. She'd spent 25 years in intelligence work, 4 with SOE and OSS during the war, 21 with the CIA during the Cold War. She'd operated on 3 different prosthetic legs, each one an improvement over the last, but none able to fully replace what she'd lost in that Turkish hunting accident in 1933. She retired to a farm in Barnesville, Maryland, 40 miles from Washington. She raised vegetables, kept chickens, and never spoke about the war. Neighbors knew her as the quiet woman with a slight limp who lived alone and minded her own business. They had no idea they were living next to a legend. July 8, 1982, Barnesville, Maryland. Virginia Hall died at 76, quietly, without fanfare, in a nursing home. The obituary in the Washington Post mentioned her CIA service but provided few details. Most of her OSS and SOE records were still classified. The French government had awarded her the Croix de Guerre with Palm, but she'd never attended the ceremony. The British had made her an honorary member of the Order of the British Empire, but she'd declined to travel to London for the investiture. She was buried in the Druid Ridge Cemetery in Pikesville, Maryland. The headstone reads simply, Virginia Hall, Goylott, 1906 to 1982. No mention of the war, no mention of the wooden leg, no mention of the prison breaks, the resistance networks, the Pyrenees crossing, or the fact that she'd caused more damage to German operations in France than entire military units. The wooden leg she'd called Cuthbert, the one that had carried her over the Pyrenees, was never found. It likely remained in that Spanish farmhouse where she'd collapsed after the crossing, eventually burned as firewood or discarded as worthless. But the story lived on. In OSS files declassified decades later, in French resistance records, in the memories of the fighters she'd trained and the airmen she'd helped escape. The Germans offered 50,000 Reichsmarks for the limping lady. They'd mobilized the Gestapo across France to find her. They'd raided dozens of safe houses, arrested hundreds of suspects, tortured and executed anyone they thought might lead them to her. They never caught her. Because Virginia Hall understood something the Germans never did. Disability wasn't weakness, it was camouflage. Who suspects a woman with a wooden leg of being a master spy? Who imagines someone who can barely walk climbing the Pyrenees in winter? Who believes a person the State Department rejected as physically unfit could organize operations that would help liberate France? The wooden leg that should have ended her career in 1933 became the tool that made her invisible. The limp that marked her different allowed her to hide in plain sight. The disability that everyone saw prevented them from seeing who she really was. She organized 3 prison breaks in occupied France, freeing 15 Allied personnel from German custody. She coordinated resistance networks that included 400 active fighters. She survived the Pyrenees crossing that had killed able-bodied men half her age. She returned to France after the Gestapo knew her description and continued operating for 6 more months. She earned the Distinguished Service Cross, the Croix de Guerre, and the MBE. She did it all on a wooden leg she nicknamed Cuthbert. The most dangerous Allied agent in France was a disabled American woman the State Department wouldn't hire. The Germans never stood a chance. If this story earned your time, hit the like button. It costs nothing and tells YouTube this video matters. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, accounts of real people facing impossible situations with nothing but skill and nerve. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Did anyone in your family serve in the Second World War? This community spans the globe, from California to Tasmania, from veterans to history students. Let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. These stories deserve to be remembered. You're helping make that happen.